wa rahmatullah wa barakat. I'm so very happy to have this opportunity to speak to you about a topic I've been working on for the past 15 years. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto's Business School, the Rotman School of Management. I've researched extensively on strategies corporations can use to become successful globally, and I have given lectures on this topic in over 30 countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, as well as Pakistan. I visited Pakistan for 3 consecutive years and worked with people in government to understand issues around global competitiveness. What I want to do today is simply talk at a high level as to what it takes for companies to be successful in the global economy. We know that Pakistan and countries in South Asia and in the Muslim world more generally have some unique challenges, and inshallah I'll have some time to discuss that as well. So most of you know this term, which is around the idea that the world is flat. Thomas Friedman is credited with coining this term, and the whole idea about underlying the concept that the world is flat is the idea that a company in Pakistan can do business with other companies in Pakistan at pretty much the same cost as it would doing business with companies around the world. And the whole idea underlying that is the rise of the internet and the digital economy, and the fact that barriers to doing international trade have very much come down. So if it were true, if the world were flat, meaning that companies in Pakistan can do business with companies in Canada as easily as they could with other companies in Pakistan but in different cities, then global strategy would be trivial. It would indeed be very easy, because global strategy would simply require the application of domestic strategy to a bigger market. But as we know, the world is not flat. There are significant costs and barriers associated with doing business internationally. And that's really what we want to talk about today. We are going to talk about all of the barriers and limitations and pitfalls associated with companies deploying a global strategy. But don't be fooled. If a company is able to deploy a global strategy, the benefits, the returns, the profitability are truly unlimited. And I will talk about companies that have been able to successfully navigate the global economy, and the returns to deploying those strategies successfully has indeed been lucrative for the company and the stakeholders, and more broadly for the home country. Because as companies from any individual country increase their global footprint, it enhances what we call head office functions. So for example, in Canada, as Canadian companies increase their activity internationally, the number of head office functions in Canada grows significantly, which creates lots of benefits, and there's a feed-on effect where basically all of those head office functions enhances the ability of other Canadian companies to also become global. But let me begin by talking about one of the biggest failures of global strategy, in this company called Target. And many of you on this call, on this webinar, would know the name. It's one of the largest retailers in the United States, and just 2 years ago it came into the Canadian market, opened something like 50 stores, and after less than 2 years, Target is going to exit Canada after racking up billions and billions of dollars in losses. And if one were to think about 2 markets that are so similar, would be Canada and the United States. We share so much in common. We're adjacent to one another. We both have English as a common language. We have free trade agreements. We're in the same time zone. were both former colonies of the UK. If you think about two markets where a global expansion would most surely work, it would be a retailer from the United States coming into Canada, and Target leaving Canada after just a few years, losing money every single day. Even Bloomberg talks about Target abandoning Canada after racking up billions of dollars in losses. And I highlighted this big quote in the big blue text at the bottom. Target did not really understand the Canadian market. It assumed it was the same as the U.S. It misunderstood the Canadian landscape, and this will go down as one of the largest retail blunders in retail history. It highlights the difficulties in global expansion, and as many people have said, it's very difficult to learn from your successes. We learn from our failures. So here's an example where even to a close and familiar market, global expansion often delivers less than expected results. So if you step back and just think, Target moves into the Canadian market, why did it fail? And I think many of you already have the answer. If I could point at any one of you randomly and ask you, what is the answer? I think you would tell me the answer, why Target failed in Canada. And the reason Target failed in Canada, it assumed the world was flat. It simply assumed that Canada was an extension of the United States. Therefore, it could take its domestic strategy and simply deploy it in a global context. And here's an example where two markets which are just so incredibly similar. There are differences, of course, but in terms of other international differences, Canada and the U.S., the differences would be less than it would be, say, between the United States and China and so on. They assumed the world is flat. They assumed they could just come into Canada, deploy exactly the same strategy. And so there are lots and lots of examples of companies that have deployed global strategies, and this is a link that talks about 10 of the most prominent companies that have deployed global strategies that have failed. And when you see this graphic here, you can see very, very clearly these are big companies, these are big names, these are companies that are globally successful, but they too have made blunders. So as an example, Mattel opened up a 36,000 square foot building in China, hoping to market its toys, but the number one toy is Barbie, thinking that everybody wants to be American. Everybody loves American products. Everybody loves American culture. They went into the Chinese market, and after just 2 years, their facility, 36,000 square feet, was closed down. And that was a massive blunder. If you look at Best Buy, they went into Europe not understanding that Europeans have a very strong preference for smaller stores. So their big box stores really did not take off, and they also so Best Buy also failed in China, and they also failed in Turkey. And one company that's not listed here, but Walmart, even when Walmart went into Germany, there was an interview with a senior member of the Walmart team, and the comment was very reflective of why Walmart did not do well in Germany. And the one comment the senior person made was, Walmart failed because we didn't understand that people in Germany like smaller pillows than people in the United States. And that's just sort of a reflection of the fact that Walmart just took their business model in the United States and simply transplanted it to Germany, not taking into account local sensitivities, and it resulted in dramatic losses. Even McDonald's, it's failed in the Caribbean, in many of the Caribbean markets, in Barbados, in the Cayman Islands, and so on. But business in the Caribbean, demand was significantly lower, revenues were significantly lower. They had to close down many of their facilities there. They simply failed, and the fourth one on this graphic here is Starbucks, which failed miserably in Australia. You think Australia, another English-speaking Anglo-Saxon economy, Walmart has done well in 100 countries around the world, but in Australia they failed, and many of these companies failed because they didn't put enough emphasis on how the local market is different, and understanding these differences between your home market and these foreign markets you're going into. These are potential pitfalls that can really undermine the success of any global strategy. So this next graphic is going to look at a high level, the concentration of multinational activity. So MNE, multinational enterprise. And what I'm going to look at now is the United States, the world's largest economy. It has the largest global footprint of any other country in the world. And we're going to look here to see, of all of the multinationals from the United States, and I can ask every single person on this webinar to give me the name of a global American company and names that would come to mind. And I can even hear you, even though your microphones are muted, I can even hear you saying companies like Apple and Google and Amazon and Microsoft and Starbucks and McDonald's and Ford and Chrysler, and I could go on for an hour because there are hundreds and hundreds of global U.S. multinationals. And so what I'm going to look at here is the following. Look at the GDP share of the three major regions of the world. North America is about 26% of the world economy. Europe is about 24% of the world economy, and Asia is about 20% of the world economy. So if the world were flat, U.S. multinationals, so companies from the United States, would have their sales distributed across the world in proportion to the GDP shares. So you might expect the sales of all U.S. multinationals, you would expect about 26% to be in North America, you might expect 24% to be in Europe, and you might expect 20% to be in Asia. And I can feel the excitement where people really want to see what the distribution is. So here it comes, and you can see in terms of sales, U.S. multinationals, about 75% of their sales are in fact in North America, only 15% in Europe, and only 6% in Asia. And you get a similar distribution when you look at assets and employment. What does this picture tell you? This picture tells you that deploying a global strategy is very, very difficult, and that's why the majority of companies do business. They do trade, they do foreign investment, they do joint ventures, strategic alliances, all these kinds of international business. They do it in their home region. They do it close by. And the reason they do it close by is the further away you get physically, culturally, religiously from your home market, the more difficult it becomes to deploy a global strategy. And this is why companies like PwC, Ernst & Young, McKinsey, Bain, work with lots and lots of companies to help them develop very successful global strategies. So when you think about distance, distance broadly defined must be well understood and compensated for. So when companies deploy a global strategy, if there's not a lot of thought, if you don't do your due diligence in deploying these global strategies, the outcomes will be less profitable than otherwise could be the case. And when you think about distance, physical distance, cultural distance, religious distance, I will speak in a few minutes about all of the efforts I personally am taking here in the Canadian market to embrace Islamic finance. And when people think about Islamic finance coming into Canada, we do not pitch it from a religious perspective. We pitch Islamic finance as a form of structured finance where basically the risks and the returns are different than what you get in conventional finance, but the religious differences are very important because many people in Canada don't understand what Islamic finance is, and they have a lot of difficulty in separating Islamic finance from this concept of Sharia. And when people hear Sharia, that puts up the alarm bells. And so what we are working with people in Canada to better understand is this is just a different form of finance available to everyone, Muslims and non-Muslims. But that's a reflection of religious differences that we are trying to mitigate. And also colonial ties. Colonial ties are unbelievably powerful, but what they do is they speak to the importance of networks and familiarity. And the whole idea that when a country has colonial ties with other countries, then what that means is often they have cultural and language similarities. So you think about countries like Pakistan and India and relationship to the United Kingdom and the whole role of the United Kingdom in giving you the kinds of institutions that you have, like the legal system or language, English as a language, whereas you look at a country like China that didn't have that relationship and therefore doesn't have the same set of laws, doesn't have the same set of familiarity, doesn't have similar languages. Now this picture here, if you look at the United States, this is a fun slide, and again this is a fantastic question I often put on the MBA, the Masters in Business exams here at the University of Toronto. So if you look at the United States, it's about $16.7 trillion of GDP. You look at Mexico, which is just to the south, it's 1.4 trillion. You look at Canada to the north, it's about 1.9 trillion. These three countries, Canada, the United States, and Mexico, have a free trade agreement. And then look across the ocean to the east. We have Europe. Europe's about $13 trillion market. So if I were to simply ask you, there's the United States, the world's largest economy. Let's look at who the United States does more business with. Does the United States do more business with Canada and Mexico, or does it do more business with all of Europe? Because if you look at all of Europe, it's about a $13 trillion economy, whereas Canada and the United States, Canada and Mexico together are like 3 to 4 trillion. So who does the United States do more trade with? Now this next slide, okay, is going to be the following. The United States trade with all of the countries within Europe. And let's look at France and the UK, which I have highlighted. If you look at France, France is about 16% of all of Europe's GDP. And so is the United Kingdom. So if I took all of the GDP in Europe, 16% of it is accounted for by France, and 16% of it is accounted for by the United Kingdom. However, if you look at U.S. trade with Europe, what share of U.S. exports go to France? What percent of U.S. exports go to the United Kingdom? Even though France and the United Kingdom are about the same size economically, they're about the same distance from the United States, they're both in Europe, the United Kingdom gets 20% of all of the U.S.'s exports to Europe, whereas France only gets 12%. So that raises an important question. Why does the United States trade so much more? Why does the United States do so much more business with the United Kingdom relative to France, given that both France and the United Kingdom are about the same distance away from the United States? Both these countries are in Europe, and the answer is, I think, obvious. Number one, the United Kingdom has English as an official language, and so does the United States. So the UK and the US share the same language. Because of the colonial history, they have a lot of cultural similarities. They have similarities in legal systems. So all of these cultural ties and so on really drive the high level of business between the United States and the United Kingdom, and you don't have that with France. And another very important dimension of the relationship is the political alignment, the fact that the UK is so politically aligned with the United States, and that matters. Now when you look at that picture, this next slide is a wow. When you see this next slide, everybody should say, wow. I'm hoping you're saying it, because now when you look at Mexico and Canada, even though Mexico is only about 5% the size of Europe, U.S. exports to Mexico are equivalent to 60% of its exports to all of Europe. And similarly, even though Canada is only about 8% the size of all of Europe, the United States does more trade with Canada than it does with all of Europe, which tells you the importance of language and cultural similarity in driving these trades. What's also interesting about Mexico and Canada, even though Mexico and Canada are both inside the North American Free Trade Agreement, they're exactly next door to the United States. Look at Canada. Canada gets so much more trade from the United States than Mexico, and that's of course driven by the fact that Canada and the United States share the similar language and also cultural history, given they were both colonies of the UK, whereas Mexico does not. So costs of doing business internationally, distance, crossing borders, culture, language, and religious differences, time zones. Time zones are incredibly important. There's evidence to show that controlling for other factors, the fact that the United States and Brazil are in a similar time zone generates more business than United States trade with an otherwise equivalent country in terms of size and distance in Europe, because when you're in the same time zone, communication costs are significantly lower. Exchange rates matter tremendously, not just the fact that the exchange rate level, we can sort of adjust for that, but exchange rate volatility. And this is why many countries have moved to fixed exchange rates, because we know that markets do not like uncertainty, and fixed exchange rates are very effective at reducing those levels of uncertainty. Compliance with local institutions and regulatory requirements, this is incredibly important, especially for the legal profession, but the whole idea that when one country moves into another country, the legal system is quite different, complying with local regulations, so one needs to do their due diligence because, and this is a very important point, is that as you move into a foreign market, trying to unwind that and deploy a strategy that is compliant is far more costly than doing it right to begin with. Legal differences really matter, and of course raising capital and financing is incredibly important, because despite this myth, a lot of the capital that is needed to invest in markets is actually raised locally, and that's sort of an important point. The Industrial Commercial Bank of China, I'm working very, very closely with this bank. I've been working with them for 3 years on their global expansion. This is a company that I believe has deployed the global strategy. This is a model. I don't know of any other company that's been as effective, that's gone by the playbook better than this company. So the Industrial Commercial Bank of China, it's the world's largest bank, 420,000 employees, and what they do is they send batches of executives, 20 to 30 at a time, to 6 different countries in the world. I work with the executives here in Canada. They come to Canada for an entire year. And why do they come to Canada for an entire year? Because living here in Canada, doing some courses at the University of Toronto, but doing internships with law firms and accounting firms and retailers and manufacturers, they really get to learn English. So all of these executives need to have English as a skill before coming to Canada, but they enhance their English skills. But most importantly, and this is such an important point that I think many foreign companies don't truly appreciate, it's the soft skills. How do you interact with people in a foreign market? The business culture, the Western culture, it's incredibly important. And the idea that someone's going to get off a plane and go into Canada or the UK or the US thinking that simply because they have the English language that they're somehow going to be able to operate effectively in those foreign markets. It just doesn't work that way, and that's why this company here has been incredibly successful at its global expansion. They've been able to mitigate They've been able to overcome many of the barriers associated with doing international business, and I compliment them for that. This is just a quick slide, and I want to point to you on the Urdu bar, but this is basically if I take the entire world's GDP, and I basically said how much of the world's GDP is accounted for by countries' official language. So because Pakistan has two official languages, English and Urdu, it would be double counted here. But in any event, you basically see here that about 35% of the world's economy is in English-speaking countries, and you look at, for Urdu, it's about 3%. But the next, and then you can see across, you can see Chinese, so that's Mandarin and Cantonese together, but Chinese, you can see the massive growth over the last 20 years in the share of the world economy accounted for by that, and that's basically China. But then the next slide looks at trade, international trade. And I'm going to flip back, and I want you to look at the Urdu bar. I want you to look at the Urdu bar, and if I just go back to GDP and then just jump forward to trade, you can see how Pakistan is underperforming relative to that benchmark in terms of global trade, and I think that's an important point to make. So this Financial Times article highlights a paper that I wrote with my graduate student who's now at Harvard University, and this paper actually won an international award, and it looks at the importance of English language. So basically what it says is the following: to the extent the country has English as its official language, controlling for all other factors that we've talked about, English delivers an additional benefit, because English really is the language of international business. The fact that we are speaking English today on this call is one reflection of that. So the fact that Pakistan has English, a proficiency in English and so on, actually should deliver Pakistan a benefit above and beyond countries that don't have those English abilities. So I have to look at China as an example, and there's an important reason for this. And if you look at China, and in 1980, Canada and China were the same size, and the rise of China is nothing short of a miracle. And I raised this example because I'm going to speak in about 2 minutes about the rise of China, but then talk about the Muslim world and ask the question, why hasn't the Muslim world risen as China has? Because we have similar population size and so on. But you look at China, it's just quite remarkable that China, on a purchasing power parity basis, is going to surpass the United States as the world's largest economy in the next year. And estimates from the IMF say it may have already happened, but we could quibble about years, but it's coming. China will soon be the world's largest economy. This is predictions by the IMF and Price Waterhouse. And you look at China, and in 2011, the United States is larger than China. But look at 2030. In 2030, China's economy is going to be $30 trillion on a purchasing power parity basis. And there it is. Look at the United States is only $23 billion, and project out to 2050. And this is just mind-boggling when you think about the size of the Chinese economy at $53 trillion, where the U.S. is $37 trillion. These are just remarkable. And this is why we talk about this century being the Asian century, because if you look at the far right and you look at 2050, 4 of the top 10 countries in 2050 are going to be from Asia, and that's China, the U.S., India, and Indonesia. Now I circle Indonesia in green because if you look at the top 10 countries in the world, Indonesia is projected to be in the top 10, the only Muslim country in the world that will be in the top 10. But the next slide is going to give us countries 11 to 20. And if I look at 11 to 20, you can see there are 3 Muslim countries that are in the top 20, and Turkey, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia. You can guess how far down I would have to go before Pakistan came into the list, but I didn't do that. I'm from Canada, and here we are at 16th. So this slide and And I would ask you to look carefully at this slide. I think this is probably the most important slide of my slide deck because it's incredibly important and speaks to the transformation of countries as they converge or as they develop. And if you look at low-cost competition, look at that bottom left box. This is where developing countries like China, like Mexico, like Bangladesh, that's where they are. They gain advantage from low-cost resources and labor. They focus on achieving great volumes and low prices. They import or copy technology, and they follow trends. That's sort of the low-value model. And then if you look at the top right, where you have an innovation-based economy, creates advantage from creating a unique market position, focus on new products and processes, develop world-class technology or set trends. And I can ask everybody on the phone to give me an example of a company that you would believe would be in the innovation-based competition. And the companies that come to mind are Apple and Google and Amazon, innovative companies. Clearly the United States, Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom are in the top right. They're in the innovation-based competition. Canada, innovation-based competition. If you think about China, Bangladesh, Mexico, Brazil, low-cost competition, it's on the left model, but they are making the transformation. They are moving. And the three most important ingredients, and one thing I spoke to government people in Islamabad. So I went to Islamabad for 3 consecutive years. I went there about 12 times, and I spoke to them about this exact slide and what is required for countries to move from the slow-cost competition to innovation-based competition. And it's exactly these things. And we could speak to that. I could ask you to think for just a second, where would you place Pakistan? But most importantly, and it's not about being negative, most importantly, where would you place Pakistan in this picture? And what would be required to get Pakistan to move to the right? Now, why is this important? This is so important for the following reason. In order for any company to do well in the global economy, it must deliver something that's innovative, something unique. And if you're operating in that low left box as a company or a country, but think of it as a company, it's going to be very difficult to deploy a global strategy and really deliver value for your stakeholders. In contrast, if you start thinking about that top right, companies that are able to do well in that top right box are exactly the companies that are going to be able to deliver significant value to their stakeholders as they deploy global strategies. And I have worked personally with over 24 companies from emerging markets and helping them develop global strategies that allow them to penetrate foreign markets, even though they're coming from environments that are low-cost competition. So companies are able to overcome these local market conditions. Okay? So if you look at China and you look at these Chinese brands, you know, Chinese brands are just becoming incredibly more prolific globally. You look at these companies here, and China is doing incredibly well, much better than companies from Muslim countries. China is just doing unbelievably well, and you look down this list and you recognize many of these names, and the global expansion and their success is nothing short of a miracle. So now I'm going to talk just for a minute about the Muslim world. And when you look at this graph here, in 1950 only 18% of the world's population was Muslim, and Muslim population is growing faster than any other religion in the world. And you can see the share of the world's population that's Muslim is about 25%, and the share of the world's non-Muslims, of course, because these two sum to 100%. If I ask you to look at that carefully with your eyes and tell me when are these two going to cross, I want you to put a number in a year in your head. If growth rates continue at these rates, how long before these two things converge? And the answer is about 20 2200, a long time from now. So it's a long time. But of course, we know that population growth slows as incomes rise. If you look at GDP per capita, look at that $5,500. That's the average income per capita in the Muslim world, whereas the global average is about 11,000. So even though Muslims form about 25% of all of the world's population, our income per person is about 1/2 of the world average. And this slide looks really, really busy, but even though we're about 25% of the world population, we're only about 10 to 11% of the world economy. That on each of these bars at the very bottom, 10.3%, 10.5%, and so on. That's the share of the world economy that comes from the world, from the Muslim world. So why do Muslim countries perform so poorly? There's lots of hypotheses, and I give an entire 2-hour lecture just on this exact topic. So if you look at the top 100 companies of the Muslim world, and this is from Dinar Standard, if you look of the world's top 500 companies, the Fortune 500, how many are from the Muslim world? So if we are 20% of the world population, 10% of the world economy, if you say we're 10% of the world economy, of the top 500 companies, maybe there's 50. The answer? 3. There's only 3 companies, these global companies that come from the Muslim world, and one needs to ask the question, why? What's going on? Okay? So now when we start thinking about deploying these global strategies, how do we deploy these global strategies? How do you rank, prioritize markets? Managers focus on close markets, ones that have similar culture, similar language. Immigration is tremendously powerful in explaining patterns of trade and investment because of networks and family. People go to big markets, but there's many, many missed opportunities. And a lot of the work that I do with companies is try to understand where the opportunities are for those companies. So here are lots of case studies. Pepsi, and the second one is the CEO of McKinsey talking about emerging markets and the opportunities available in emerging markets for companies. So why do managers deploy global strategies? And this is actually, very often managers say bigger is better. We need a global footprint. Managers often overestimate what the benefits are. There's this thing called follow the leader. This is Knickerbocker's work, but basically if other companies deploy a global strategy, therefore we need to deploy a global strategy. So Gemawatt, Pankaj Gemawatt, came up with a fantastic framework called the CAGE framework, C-A-G-E. The CAGE framework is a way to deploy global strategies in an efficient way, and this is an important slide because you look at it and it says, I've got a pecking order. I've got the least productive firms, intermediate productive, and the most productive firms. And what you see is that companies that engage in foreign investment, companies that deploy these global strategies are really the most productive. Intermediate levels of productivity, so those firms that are at intermediate level actually do lots of international trade. And here's the key insight from this slide. If a company wants to deploy a global strategy, they need to develop something that's innovative, something that's distinctive, something that allows them to be successful internationally. So when I go back to that model I had before about low cost versus innovative model, the company needs to think about getting into that innovative mindset. So deploying global strategies is very, very difficult. Firms must be productive to succeed. If a firm is doing well domestically, then it can do well internationally. So when firms are doing well domestically, the global opportunities are absolutely immense. Global strategy can deliver significant value to stakeholders, but it has to be done carefully. So once a firm does decide to go global, how does it do it? And here, and again, we give an entire lecture on each one of these opportunities. But what are the opportunities? They go from the lowest commitment to the highest commitment. So this is the whole idea that once a company does decide to deploy a global strategy, how do you do it? the one, don't do it. But secondly, sell to a home country exporting agent or a foreign country importing agent. 3, contract with a foreign country importing agent. Foreign, establish a foreign subsidiary that imports, license production to foreign manufacturer. Or 6, establish a foreign subsidiary either via acquisition or greenfield. So these go from the lowest levels of commitment to the highest levels of commitment, and companies need to think very, very carefully at what is the mode, what is the method, what are the channels by which these foreign markets are going to be served? Is it going to be through trade? Is it going to be through foreign investment? And how is one going to enter? And so few companies can afford to enter all markets. You know, this shows a picture of some, but the track record shows picking the most attractive foreign markets, determine the best time to enter them, so timing's important, select the right partners and the right levels of investment, and that's very, very difficult to do. Najib Sawiris, one of the biggest investors, he's one of the richest men from Egypt. He came into the Canadian market. This is a YouTube video where he talks about all of the difficulties he had coming into Canada. But what's important about that is he's been very, very successful in many other markets, but he's had difficulty. Deploying a global strategy is not easy. How do you do it right? And here are the key ideas. Market size and growth rates are important. Institutional context, the competitive environment. These are methods that you go through doing your due diligence. And as I mentioned before, the CAGE framework, which is Gemma-Watt's model, cultural, administrative, geographic, and economic distance, are things that need to be taken into account in identifying the right markets, but how to enter. And so when to enter is a critical decision. Often managers believe that it's urgent to enter, but the whole idea is that one needs to be careful, one needs to take one's time, undertake your due diligence, and when you enter markets, it can be very lucrative if it's done properly. Now, I want to talk about this concept called liability of foreignness. So when operating in a foreign market, firms may acquire a phenomenon known as liability of foreignness, and what it's defined as is the inherent disadvantage foreign firms experience in host countries because of their non-native status. And this is especially true when investors are coming from Muslim countries. And I want to speak to 3 case studies. One, Dubai ports. So I think many of you on the call would remember this case. But when Dubai ports, you know, they have Dubai is an incredibly competitive logistics hub. They move lots and lots of cargo through sea, by ships, by air, and so on. And a big backlash after 9/11 when they wanted to buy some ports in the United States. And there's just very racist attacks on Muslims and on Arabs. How could we let them control entry points in the United States? A big political backlash. Here's another example. CNOOC is a state-owned enterprise in China, and they tried to buy a big energy asset in Canada, and there was big pushback because CNOOC is a state-owned company, and the whole idea is CNOOC and they did not do their due diligence in terms of really promoting what the reasons for, what the motivations were for CNOOC to buy these Canadian assets. So many people in Canada sort of pushed back and said, you know, the state-owned company wants to buy this asset in Canada. Is this a commercial play, or is this really driven by the Chinese government wanting to use this asset for some political reason? So they didn't do their due diligence, and I think that was a missed opportunity. And that's a picture of me there. But I've been working extensively trying to bring Islamic finance into the Canadian market. I've worked closely with the federal government, the provincial government, the city government. There's a lot of Islamic finance going on in Canada, but again, the liability of foreignness is a big factor. So the upshot on global strategy, opportunities in the global economy are immense. The potential is enormous. But one needs to understand why the company wishes to deploy a global strategy. And if going global is the right thing to do, then due diligence is key. And I've given you a taste of what the steps are in deploying a global strategy. But of course, all that I've talked about today is a full course I teach here in the graduate program at the University of Toronto, which spans about 6 months. And with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll turn the microphone back over to Ali.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Hejazi, for a very, very intriguing presentation that you've delivered. Folks, we are now open for question and answers. If you have any questions, you could either put it in the question box, there's a question box, a chat box, or you could raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on your console, right side. So if you click on it, there's a hand icon. I will unmute you so you can speak directly with Professor Hejazi. So let me go straight to the question box. I see there are a few questions. First being from Sister Fazila Hanif. The question is, please explain how can religious difference can be a factor of cost of doing business internationally?
Yeah, so let me just give a small example. That's a fantastic question. Thank you so much for that question. But one thing that we know explains business tremendously is familiarity. And when people have a familiarity with the business or the product or the service, they're far more likely to buy that. Now, there are exceptions where people want to do things that are exotic or different, and that's fine, but those tend to be niche. So I give one example. We know that in the United Kingdom, Subway, which is now the largest fast food chain in the world, in the United Kingdom, Subway is now halal. And there's been a big pushback where many people say, you know, if I want to eat something that's pork, if I want to eat ham, I can no longer go to a Subway. To which the response from Subway and other retailers and companies that are now producing products that are halal, the response is, well, this is a business decision. If you don't want to come to Subway, then don't come to Subway, go to another place. But the reason I say that is when people don't understand what halal means, when people don't understand what these religious differences mean, it really, really scares them. So another example, in Seattle, in the United States, you can now get a Sharia compliant mortgage. And for everybody on the phone that knows anything about Islamic finance, we know riba is haram, interest is forbidden, but that doesn't mean you get to borrow the money for free. So when you buy a home using a Sharia compliant mortgage or a conventional mortgage, what you're going to pay is the same. They're competitive. You pay the same amount, but the structure, the way these mortgages are structured, is fundamentally different. So Fox News had a big report talking about how Islamic finance is going to hurt Christians. And the way they said it was Muslims now can get an interest-free mortgage, They can get a Sharia mortgage, and everybody that was commenting on the story was saying, wow, because they're Muslim, they get to buy a house, they don't have to pay any interest. So simply because they're a Muslim, they can borrow money for free. Again, it's a lack of understanding, because if they were to understand the point, they would understand that what you pay with the Sharia mortgage or conventional mortgage is the same. The last comment I'll make, I was giving a big lecture about Islamic finance and Sharia finance, and a Muslim woman stood up and started relating that to Sharia law, and especially the treatment of women in the Middle East. And so I bring that example up because people that don't know anything about Muslims, they don't know about Sharia, they automatically put their back up. And then now that lack of understanding really becomes a barrier to doing business. And that is why creating familiarity, doing your due diligence to mitigate or reduce the lack of understanding of the product or the service that you're delivering goes a long, long way. I can go on, but I'll stop unless you want to follow up.
Well, thank you very much for a very comprehensive answer. Let me go to callers who have raised a hand. We have a first caller. Mr. Muhammad Bilaluddin. Brother Muhammad Bilaluddin, could you hear us? Please introduce yourself and ask the question. Brother Muhammad Bilaluddin, I believe you raised your hand, but I noticed that you've also posted your questions in the box, so let me go straight to your question. What are the lessons to be learned from U.S. trade with its partners by Pakistan and India?
Yeah, that's another wonderful question. And when you think about what it tells you is that when you look at U.S. trade and you look at European trade, a lot of it is with close and familiar markets. But even when you look at UK trade with the world, controlling for other things, cultural and language and colonial ties drive trade and international business successfully. Why do I say that? You look at India. India is making unbelievable inroads into the West in terms of its trade and foreign investment. I'm not sure how many people on this call have seen the flurry of articles about the number of CEOs, chief executive officers, in Fortune 500 companies that are Indian. And that's all driven by abilities, but it's also driven by cultural and language familiarity and historical ties. What this says is that I believe Pakistan can do far better internationally, but as everybody on the call knows, including myself, Pakistan has a whole host of problems, political and security issues that are beyond the control of an individual company. So I think, coming to the question directly, Pakistani companies can do well internationally, and many Pakistani companies are doing well internationally. However, the barriers, because once you attach Pakistan to the company name, it becomes difficult. Now, we have a student here at the Rotman School. He's from one of Pakistan's most affluent families. If I told you his name, you would know the family. He is here in Canada doing his MBA, but the reason he is here in Canada is to enhance his family's business, their presence in Canada. So I raise this to show that Pakistan, like India, can do very well internationally. It can emulate the strategies deployed by US and British multinationals, but the barriers are higher. Pakistani companies have to work a little bit harder to penetrate Western markets, but there's a lot of markets within Asia that Pakistan can also do well in, where the liability of foreignness would not be so great. I'll stop with that.
Well, thank you very much. We have a supplementary question on the expansion from Brother Hejazi Akbar. The question is, how Pakistani chartered accountant firms can go international?
Which firms? I'm sorry?
CA firms, chartered accountants.
Yeah, chartered accountant firms. So, you know, as we know, I wish I had shared another slide, and I stumbled because I have my other computer, but I can't share that screen. But, you know, if you look at the number of jobs that are being globally outsourced, okay, accounting and finance is a big area. Why do I say this? Because if you look, you know, and there's, please forgive me, but we know the work and the creativity and the thought that goes into many of the work that chartered accountants do. But to the extent it's an automated approach. So when you think about preparing financial statements, and I know chartered accountants do a lot more than that, but when you think about preparing financial statements, and to some extent some auditing, a lot of that can be done using very sophisticated computer algorithms. And so the reason I say that is we're increasingly seeing a lot of these functions moving out of the United States and Western markets into places like India, and I would argue as well Pakistan as well. But in order to come into these markets, one thing that into Western markets, one of the big challenges is reputation. And as you know, there's this famous line: you can never go broke by following the advice of PwC or IBM or McKinsey. And the whole idea is when you think about accounting and finance and consulting more generally, reputation is incredibly important. So I know many former MBA students that have their own firms, but the barriers are pretty high to developing business, because a lot of the business that you want to develop in these Western markets is very much driven by networks and relationships and anchor clients. So I encourage CA firms to think about moving into these global markets. They can be incredibly lucrative, but the barriers are high. That's why entry through a joint venture is often preferred, because with a joint venture, you tap into an existing company's network already, but if it's a reputable firm, it mitigates the liability of foreignness.
Thank you very much. Another interesting one from Mr. Hassan Mahmood. The question is, using local human capitals can help overcome cultural differences. What are your thoughts on that? How effective it can be?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And so one of the big criticisms of Chinese investment into Western markets is they want to use only Chinese people. And so even the program I talked about before, where Chinese companies send their people to Canada for a year, and even that, spending a year in Canada or the United States or the UK is not enough to really mitigate the liability of foreigners, to really understand the foreign culture. That's why in any global expansion, sourcing labor from the local market is incredibly important, because these people, as they come into your local market, it creates familiarity with the customers, but they have an understanding of the local landscape. They understand what it's like to interact and build relationships and networks that no one from a foreign country can fully understand. Even people from the UK that come to Canada, there are differences. So sourcing local talent is very important. And I just give you an example: Emirates Air, a global powerhouse. I think everybody on this call has been on an Emirates plane. The head of their company here in Canada is a Canadian, and that's very important.
Okay, thank you very much once again. We have a number of questions. I'm trying to be a bit selective. I'm concerned about the time constraints also, Mr. Hejazi, Professor Hejazi, you have. So let me go to another question from Mr. Zishan Haider. The question is, what China did differently that brought her to the top economies in the last 20 years? Which model they used? Low-cost model or innovation-based model?
That's a fantastic question, and Ali, I wish you gave me 3 hours today instead of only 90 minutes, because I have a nice lecture on the rise of China. And in fact, if you look at China, I showed you a picture that only goes back to 1980, where the Chinese economy was only about 3% of the world economy. So in 1980, China was 3% of the world economy. But I'm not sure how many people on this call would know that if I went back 200 years, so if I went back to the early 1800s, China was about 20% of the world economy. And in fact, if I go back 2,000 years, so from the year 1, where we have data, believe it or not, China has always been about 20 to 30% of the global economy. So China's always been a big player, but it's just during the Opium Wars in the late 1800s and the Industrial Revolution that China collapsed. So China collapsed in the 1800s, and they woke up in 1950, 1960. So what model did they use? Number one, you know, number one, they had stability. One of the most important factors in attracting foreign companies, the most important factor, more than anything, is stability. Because a foreign investor is not going, even if you have the most ideal resources and labor, if you don't have stability, they worry about losing their investment. So China has stability. That's number one. Secondly, they have a very, very large labor pool. So what the Chinese government has been able to do is use this low-cost model. So if I'm just going to fly back up to this low-cost model, but they had this. So they had this low-cost model, and the challenge now with China is the following. China's now at the point where it developed this low-cost model. Bangladesh, and I raised Bangladesh, there's lots of other countries, is exactly doing what China did. Bangladesh and Vietnam, in the Philippines, and Malaysia are all in that low-cost model. Basically what they've been able to do is to tell Western multinationals, bring your production to China, we will deliver to you quality and consistency in a stable environment. And if you look at China, there's a billion people, 1.3 billion people, but China now has labor shortages. And you wonder, how is that possible? And China has labor shortages, and the way we know that is if there was unlimited labor, wages wouldn't be rising. But wages are rising significantly in China because you simply cannot take people from the countryside and put them into manufacturing. So from 1950, 1960, China has been in that low-cost competition model. But now what's happening is China's in the transformation phase. China is moving from the low-cost to the innovation-based competition. By the way, I could ask you what country most recently made that jump from low cost to innovation based. And the two countries that come to mind immediately are Japan. Japan was that low cost model. It was copying US technology. It was producing cheap stuff. It was exactly China. In fact, a study just came out to show that where China is today is where Japan was in 1960. But Japan and South Korea both made the jump to innovation-based competition. China today is exactly making that transformation. But here's the big problem in China. What's limiting China's ability to create innovation is the lack of protection for intellectual property. So if I'm a Chinese business person and I have a fantastic idea for a new product or a new brand or a new service, one of the big problems in China is the lack of protection for intellectual property. And so if I were to develop this new product or process in a China environment, everybody copies it. So I met with the senior leadership at Lenovo, and everybody knows Lenovo in China, and they estimate that about 80%, so more than 3/4 of all of the peripherals. What do I mean by that? USB keys, a mouse, a keyboard, all of these external pieces that go to a computer, about 80% of them in the Chinese market are actually counterfeit. So protection for intellectual property is very, very important. So I would argue that all countries begin in that low competition model, but to move up to the innovation-based model, which is what China is doing right now, that is why they're going so aggressive after corruption. That's why China is so aggressively going after counterfeiting. There's still a lot of corruption. There's still lots of counterfeiting, but they're trying to address that because the only way to make that jump, the only way for China to continue to be prosperous going forward is to be in that innovation-based competition. The last one is the whole idea of human capital. The brightest and the best from China all emigrate to the United States because that's where the economic opportunities are. Okay, and I'll stop there.
Thank you. Another China-specific question. In the graph from Brother Muhammad Farooq Wasi, the question is, in the graph that reflects the US and China contribution to the trade, we see a downward shift in the graph for the US. Despite having a strong economical past and with an even stronger global strategy, why is the shift downward for the US now and will be lower than China in 2016?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I'm trying to find that slide. There. You know, if you look at China, there's this model, and I'm sorry for being technical, but there's this model called the Solow growth model. So Robert Solow won the Nobel Prize for it. But what it always predicts is this thing called convergence. What do I mean by that? When you look at a country like China, it's been growing, you know, at 10 to 15% for 3 decades. But there's impossible for that to continue, because if China continued to grow like that, it would be half, 3/4, it would take over the whole world economy in the limit. So the idea is that China's growth will slow, and we're exactly seeing that now. China, people are predicting, it's a debate, but they're predicting that this is the new normal, where China's growth will be in the 5 to 8% range. And then in 1 or 2 decades, it will be in the 3% range. China's growth will converge to the growth in the developed world. So to answer the question directly, there's no question there's a massive shift in the global economy. We call this the shift in economic geography. China is becoming much more important, much more prominent. The US is becoming less so. But that difference will stabilize. Will China ever become a bigger trader than the United States? I think the answer is absolutely yes, because when you look at the data, and you look at the data on the size of economies, and you just see, look at the size of the Chinese economy. In 2050, China's economy is going to be twice the size, or 50% larger than the United States. It's very likely going to be a bigger trader. However, when it comes to innovation and multinational, so I've sort of not been clear on the difference between trade, where I produce a product and export it, versus I have a company that operates in a foreign market. So trade versus multinationals doing business internationally. There's no question, in my opinion, China will overcome the US as the world's largest trader. Absolutely. Will it overcome the US in terms of multinational business activity? I'm not so sure about that, and the reason is that in order to do well internationally, and one of the themes of this talk is that one needs to be innovative. I don't think China will ever be as innovative as the US, so it's unlikely China will be able to create products and have global brands that will rival the US, but time will tell.
Okay, sir. Another one from Mr. SM Sohail, FCA from Pakistan. My question is that a Pakistani chartered accountant firm has some opportunity for online advisory services. And equally, there is a supplementary question from Sister Fazila that how can chartered accountant firms from Pakistan can penetrate specifically into Canadian markets?
Yeah, these are both fantastic questions. And in terms of online advisory, that's a huge market. I mean, I cannot explain the amount that's going on through the online space. And again, a lot of this is driven by familiarity and networks. Now, forgive me, please forgive me, but the idea that a Canadian company is going to create a relationship with a Pakistani CA firm that they don't know, it's very difficult. That's why having a local presence where people really know who you are, where they understand who you are, what services you're providing, and so on, one needs to build that trust, that brand recognition. So how do you do that? that's the challenge. And so, for example, here's one small example. Here's one small example. Imagine someone from Pakistan does an executive MBA in Canada. When you do an executive MBA in Canada, for example, you now build a network and a relationship with 60 other executives. They get to know you. Now when you start to work with them, they trust you, they understand you, they know you as a person, as distinct from this far away, anonymous online company. So that's why that familiarity is so important. But I would encourage you strongly to work to develop these online opportunities, because as I said before, the data are very, very clear. When you look at finance and accounting and the amount of finance and accounting services that are being outsourced from Canada to places like India and Pakistan, but India in particular, they're unbelievable. One thing I will say, there's many intermediaries. You look at companies like Infosys. You know, I don't know how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees they have, but they have a very strong presence, and it's a big brand in Canada. And through that network, they connect. They're able to facilitate these relationships. In terms of a CA firm coming to Canada, there are compliance regulations. And Brother Ali, if any Pakistani firm wanted to move into Canada, I can certainly connect them with someone who can advise on what the obstacles are from a legal and regulatory perspective. Because the first question you want to ask is, if I were to move into Canada, you know, what are the legal requirements? What are the compliance requirements? Because having a presence here opens up unbelievable opportunities that having an online presence alone wouldn't deliver.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Hejazi. That's a very welcoming statement, quite encouraging for the Pakistani firms who want to move. An open invitation from Dr. Hejazi that you guys can reach him directly. But let me move to another question, short one from Ali Haider. The question is, what is your comment on the current crisis in China?
Absolutely. That's a fantastic question. In fact, I was on TV here in Canada last evening talking exactly about that topic and what the implications are for the Canadian economy. You know, one of the things about China is the following. In the West, there's a lot of mistrust in China because people don't really know what the numbers are, to what extent the Chinese government is manipulating the numbers. There's lots of uncertainty. But I believe the number one issue going on in China is the following. China cannot grow. It's impossible for China to continue to grow at 10%. It can't. China's growth will slow. The same thing in Japan. Many people on this call are probably too young and don't remember that when Japan was growing like China in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, Japan was growing at 10, 12% regularly. And then Japan's growth slowed down. That's that convergence result that economics predicts and that no country ever in history has been able to violate, ever. Countries' growth always slows to become like that in a developed world. And China is at that transformation point. What's really happening in China is moving from that low-cost model to the innovation-based model. If you think about the world economy and you think about what drove China's growth has been driven by creating all of these products and selling them to the United States and Europe and the rest of the world. But with the global economy being weak, with the US and Europe in a weak state, growth in China cannot continue at its same pace if the markets they serve are not growing. And so therefore, China needs to rebalance its economy. Instead of being an export-dominated economy, it has to begin to think more about domestic production. And so what happened in China is the following. Many people in China took their life savings and put them into the stock market. The saving rates are really, really high, but they're unsustainable. And you look at the United States, what people do with their incomes is they spend it. In the United States, people save only a little bit and they spend everything. In the U.S. economy, that's why everybody wants to get access to the U.S. economy, because everybody spends, it can drive your whole business. In China, people are not buying consumer goods to the same extent. They're putting their money in financial markets. They're putting their money in the stock market. But because of the rebalancing that has to go on, where China has to think less about supplying global markets and more about supplying its domestic market, people in China need to begin spending their money more. And so really what's happening in China, we're in the midst of this global shift where China and China's domestic market is going to become the engine of growth of China going forward, in the same way the U.S. market is the engine of the growth in the West. So I would argue all of the uncertainty in China, all of this global market is really driven by China coming to terms with the new global realities, China understanding that it cannot continue to depend on the West for its growth. China needs to look inside China to develop domestic markets, so Chinese begin to buy Chinese products instead of Chinese people buying products from the West. So I actually believe, despite all of the global uncertainty, despite all of the volatility, what's happening in China right now reflects a maturing. The Chinese economy is maturing, and they're moving from a low-cost to an innovation-based model. And of course, if you have money in the stock market, you're not happy. However, this reflects this change, and I think there's good days to come.
Dr. Hejazi, one question for myself. How's the West perceiving this initiative of economic corridor that China and Pakistan is building?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ali, I don't know how much people on the call know anything about what's called the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is an attempt by the United States to create a free trade agreement with a bunch of countries in Asia, not Pakistan, not India, but what they're trying to do, this would be 40% of the world economy. Why is the United States doing that? The United States is trying to counter China. And so when China has this proposal, this initiative to engage countries like Pakistan, the United States does not like it. And this is what, please forgive me. I'm going to say something, maybe I shouldn't say it, but please forgive me. But this is what upsets me about many of the countries, particularly in the Muslim world. The United States does not treat them as an equal partner, and then when a country like Pakistan tries to develop deeper ties with a country like China, the Americans and Europeans get upset. So I believe engaging China, but trying to create a level playing field where Pakistani companies can get access to China and products can move back and forth, enhance competition on a level playing field might be the one thing that can really help Pakistan move forward. Now, I'm going to now say something where everybody on the phone is going to say, maybe he shouldn't have said that, but would economic development and prosperity allow Pakistan to be more stable? I believe yes. You may not, I don't know what people on the call believe, but I actually believe that what most people care about, is delivering economic prosperity and stability and safety for their families. And as economies become more and more developed, and as incomes per capita rise, companies become more stable. So I'm so hopeful that if China and Pakistan develop a deeper relationship, that may allow Pakistan to become more prosperous, and as a result of that, more stable. And I'd really, really hope the Americans don't try to undermine that.
On the same note of global envism that you touched upon, we have another supplementary question from Brother Ali Akbar. The question is, how do you see the impact of Iran coming out of oblivion and whoring the international trade since they have quite a large indigenous industrial base?
Yeah, what's remarkable about Iran is the fact that Iran, despite all of the sanctions, so the Iranian Revolution in 1979, despite all of that, despite the sanctions, the really difficult sanctions in the last decade, Iran has been doing unbelievably well in terms of technical advance. And, I don't care so much about the missiles that they're developing, but it reflects an underlying sophistication. I was actually in Iran as a guest of a local university, and I got to visit several university sites, no military, but several university sites, and the equipment they have, it's unbelievable. So I actually think, and one other point I will mention is that Iran and Iraq, but Iran in particular, hasn't done any major oil exploration for 30 years. So the amount of oil in Iran is unbelievable, far more than what the proven reserves tell you. So I actually think as Iran comes online, and it's already started, the British have opened their embassy there. A lot of the sanctions related to airplane parts have been lifted. I know several Canadian pharmaceutical companies have made contact in Iran to develop opportunities and so on. As Iran comes online, that is going to be an unbelievable opportunity for companies in the region, Pakistan included, to participate in the rebuilding, in the resurgence of Iran, and also because of the large number of Iranians in the world, in the region, that's going to, and as I said at the beginning of this call, immigration patterns are tremendously powerful predictors of trade and business flows. Iran is well placed to take advantage of the global network of Iranians internationally, including in Canada, including in Pakistan, and so on. I think that as Iran comes online, it's going to create a lot of economic opportunities. Of course, I haven't said anything about the political implications and the military implications, because as Iran comes online and becomes a larger military power, that may create challenges with countries like Saudi Arabia, but that's a different discussion.
Dr. Hejazi, I understand you're pressed on the time, but let me just take one last question. And folks, with apologies, because I know a lot of you have posted a number of other questions and comments. So let me just randomly pick one from Professor Bashir, since you briefly mentioned the politics, Professor Hejazi. How much politics play a role in success of globalization, and what mitigation strategies we have?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And one of the challenges with the Muslim world, if you look at the U.S. presidential election and the Canadian prime ministerial election that's going on right now, I, as a Muslim, it hurts me when many politicians are able to say such bad things about the Muslim world in order to get reelected. And so that just tells you that the Muslim populations in the West are far too weak to influence governments here. And so what ends up happening is many of the opportunities, for example, for the United States and Europe to engage Muslim countries in order to bring them into the economic network of economies in the West, I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of, I would argue, lack of familiarity, or many people in the West being concerned about Muslim countries becoming economically strong. I mean, one only needs to point to Turkey and the fact that Turkey has not been invited into the European Union. And you could go on and on and on to try to rationalize that. But one thing that you can't rationalize is that because Turkey is a Muslim country, it hasn't been brought into the European Union, and therefore its potential growth, and again, I truly believe this, notwithstanding all of the complications, that once countries become more and more prosperous, they become more and more stable. So I believe that if Pakistan and Turkey and Bangladesh and Indonesia, if they were more integrated into the Western economies, and I think they're not driven by one thing. I think it's a lack of political alignment, and I think a lot of that is driven by difference, lack of familiarity, lack of similarity in terms of religions and cultures, and I think that undermines the long-term prosperity of Muslim countries, in particular Pakistan.
Okay, well, that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. I really want to thank you, Professor Hejazi, but before we dismiss out, any concluding remarks that you would like to give?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ali, for giving me this opportunity. We've hit on so many possible discussion points, but this is incredibly complicated. But the one comment I want to make is the following. Michael Porter, who's the father of modern strategy. Michael Porter is a professor at Harvard Business School. He said it best. He said that there's so much need in the world, so much poverty and agony and bad things going on in the world. He said there's not enough economic aid there just isn't enough money to address all of the challenges that the human life has. But he said that you look at capitalism. He said look at business strategy. And he said look at what's happened in China and India. Because China and India have been allowed to integrate into the Western economies and get access to technology and foreign markets. Because of those linkages, look at all of the growth and prosperity that's been created in India and China. They've raised the human condition in those countries. There wasn't enough money in the world to do that, but what did it was economic opportunity. I believe the Muslim world needs to be treated in a similar way, where we're giving access and respect to Western markets, and I think with that comes economic prosperity and development, and I believe stability. And with that, I will stop.
Very eloquent, Professor Hejazi. Once again, I really want to thank you, and thank you on behalf of the ICAP Pakistan for your time and for giving us very valuable information, especially it's quite early. I mean, you woke up at 5 in the morning. I know we coordinated and you have another class to go ahead. So I won't take much of your time. But thank you very much. And thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. This is an excellent initiative taken by ICAP. We look forward to managing and moderating, facilitating more webinars within ease for you to attend from wherever you are to claim the CPDs as well. So thank you very much for making it an interactive experience for all of us. So with that note, I would like to end this webinar. You all have